Hi there, knitters. Welcome to episode 41 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Today we are going to be looking at steam blocking, and we are going to waste no time jumping right in. And we've got two parts to the video, if you will. I'm going to be doing some top-down demonstrations showing you how to use both an iron or a handheld steamer. And then we're going to come back and answer some of the questions that came out of last week's video. Some of them pertain to steam blocking and some of them pertain to just swatching and blocking your swatch in general. So come on back after the demonstrations and let's talk a little bit more about steam blocking and blocking in general. So for the first method of steam blocking, I'm going to demonstrate it using my iron. Every iron is going to have slightly different settings, but on mine, I have a linen and cotton setting, and you can see this little symbol here that shows like high steam. And I've also got a high steam setting here. So when you are steam blocking using an iron, make sure that you set it to your steam setting so that you can get the most use out of the iron. The cooler the temperature, the lower the steam, so you're going to want to crank everything as high as you can go. I'm also going to do a second demonstration shortly showing my hand steamer, but I think an iron is the most common method. So we're going to start. You can see how rumply this little swatch is. So we're going to steam this little swatch. So I used this in a previous video to demonstrate how to work a pocket. So what we're going to do is steam block it so you can get a sense of what you can accomplish with steam blocking, whether you do it with pins or without pins. And I'm going to demonstrate how to do it without pins first. So the unpinned method is the method that I prefer to use. It is what I learned when I learned how to do steam blocking, and I find it gives me more flexibility in how I shape the swatch or whatever the project is as I steam it. So I should back up and say there are a couple different thoughts on whether you should use a towel over your project when you steam block versus not. I don't. And again, it gives me more flexibility in how I manipulate my swatch as I'm steaming it. But if you're curious about the method of putting a towel over your work before you steam it, please definitely go do some searching on YouTube. I know there are lots of tutorials with people demonstrating that method as well. So essentially what we're going to do is lay our swatch out in the approximate shape that we want it to be in. We're going to pick up our iron, hold it over it, make sure you're not touching your project, and just blast it with steam. And each iron is going to have a slightly different amount of steam that it puts out. So now while the fabric is nice and hot, I'm just going to press it down into the shape that I want it to be. In this case, I really want this edge flattened out. You can flip the swatch over and do the same thing. We're just going to get it nice and close, but not touching, and steam directly down onto the swatch. For me, it takes about 3 steams with my iron. And again, when it's nice and hot, you're just going to manipulate out the edges. And your hands are going to get really warm doing this, but you can sort of pull it out into the shape that you want it to be in, and then let it dry. So when it's dry, I guess I should say when it's cool to the touch, then you would consider that swatch done. Now, this is fairly imprecise. I just did it by steaming and putting my hands over it to get it into the shape that I want. Now I can show you how to do it when you're using a pinned out method. So using the pinned out method is going to be very similar to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago when I was discussing dry or spray blocking with you. You're going to use your pins to pin your swatch out to your desired dimensions, which means you're going to be kind of tugging it out into shape so that you can ensure that it is the finished shape and size when you're done. In the dry blocking video, and I believe in last week's video when we talked about swatching, I showed you the blocking combs where they had the multiple pins all in one comb to make your edges nice and straight. I'm not going to use that for this method, largely because those handles are plastic, and we're going to be putting a lot of heat onto this swatch, and I just want to be sure that we're not going to be melting our plastic. So I'm going to recommend you do this with pins, specifically metal pins. If you have those little sewing pins that have the little balls on top of them are plastic, I wouldn't recommend those. So now we've got this all pinned out to our dimensions, and we're going to do exactly what we just did on the no pin method. We're going to hold our iron as close as we can, and your pin height is going to determine how close you can get. And we're just going to give that a big old steam. And in this case, you can give it lots of steam. When I'm doing it by hand, I only do about 3 bursts of steam because I have to touch it with my hand. When you're using the pinned out method, you can get it really, really hot. It can be really, really damp, and then you're just going to leave it pinned out. There's nothing else you need to do. And when it's cool to the touch, like right now it's still quite warm, once it's cool to the touch, you can simply unpin your project and you're ready to go. So now my swatch is all nice and cool to the touch. It's unpinned and it's nice and flat. I didn't have to do anything with my hands. Having it pinned out just allowed it to just cool naturally, and now it's ready to go. So if this was a project that I wanted to send to someone, it's considered blocked and finished. Now when it comes to handheld steamers, if you have one that will still perform when held horizontal over your work, you can absolutely use it in exactly the same method that I just showed you, holding it over your work, getting it nice and hot and damp, and then either flattening it with your hand, sort of pulling it out to dimensions, or using the pinned method. Because these heads are often a lot smaller than a traditional iron, you can probably get a lot closer to your work if it's large enough when you've got it pinned out. So this might be a really effective method for that. However, I'm going to demonstrate how I typically use this, and it's going to look an awful lot like just steaming your regular garments. So now we're going to take a look at how I use the handheld steamer that I have, that a lot of people have for refreshing their clothes. And we're going to be using it on this basalt shawl that I have here hanging up. So when it comes to steam blocking a project that has already been finished and blocked, it's kind of a refresh method, right? This has been packed away, and so it's got kind of wrinkles in it. So we're going to treat it just like we would if we were steam blocking a garment. Once again, I've got this set up to the highest temperature it can, and because this is a garment that has a lot of weight to it, we're going to let gravity do a lot of the work for us. So we're going to turn our steamer on and get moving on getting rid of some of those wrinkles. Going to wait for some steam. There we go. And we're simply going to hold this in front of our work, making sure not to touch the fabric with the actual face of the steamer. We're just going to hold it in front of the project. And as the project gets warm to the touch, you can give it a little pull down to try and help the gravity, which is already doing a lot of the work, to just smooth out your knits. There's quite a crease here. If you're going to put your hand behind it, be very careful. It gets hot. But it's essentially just like steaming any regular garment. You could do this exact same thing with your iron on a high steam setting. It would just take a lot more work to keep pushing the button because this has a constant on function. So there we go. Now that the wrinkles have all fallen out of it, I'm going to let it hang there and cool before I pick it up, because the stitches are still quite warm. They can be malleable and you just don't want to stretch them out. So 2 weeks ago, we had a video where we talked about dry blocking or spray blocking, basically pinning out your project to the dimensions that you want it to, getting it wet using a spray bottle and then letting it dry in the dimensions. And one of the reasons, actually I think the main reason that I discussed that option is it allows you to predetermine the size of your project. When you wet block a project, you can sometimes get more growth than you're expecting, especially if you're knitting something like a shawl or a really large cardigan. Because there's so much weight to the fabric, because it's such a large object, wet blocking can change it pretty drastically. Steam blocking is very similar in that respect. You can control the growth of your project while still allowing the fibers to relax. You're adding heat, and because you're using steam to add the heat, you're also adding moisture so your fibers can relax or bloom. But it's not what I would consider a proper finish for a garment. And that actually rolls into one of the questions that we got from last week's video. So I'd like to discuss that first because it's very much in the vein of what we're talking about today. So the question is, I plan to do a normal soak and block of my finished sweater. Will a steam block result be similar enough to the final full or wet block for me to base my sizing on this? I should back up and say she was asking about knitting the sleeves to length. So yes, it can. So in the first demonstration that I showed you where I had the swatch laid out and it was unpinned, as I added the steam, I was able to push the swatch flat and shape it out to the dimensions that I wanted it to be. Now, a sleeve versus a little square like this is obviously a slightly different game, but you can do the same thing with your garment. You can lay it down on a flat surface. In this case, I would recommend an ironing board if you have one. And I believe you said that you had a handheld steamer. You're going to want to do it on a flat surface rather than hanging it like we did in the example where I had the basalt. Largely because if you steamed any part of the shoulder, I'd be worried about like little puckers that you might get in your shoulder. So yes, steam blocking can give you an approximation, but you would need to sort of manipulate those stitches to sort of their fullest length to give you a rough estimate of what a final wet block is going to do. So I would say that yes, it can be used as an approximation, but you should also expect there to be some additional growth beyond that. I think when you add steam to a yoke and a full sweater, it is a good approximation. It'll tell you if you're in the range of where your yoke depth should be, or if you're in the range of where your sleeve length should be. But I would not say that that's going to be the final size. You can expect to probably get a little bit more growth when you wet block your sweater, even if you've done a steam block just to test it. So use it with caution. I would say measure your sleeve length before you steam it so that you know what the pre-blocked length is, and then measure it again so you can get an approximation of how much growth you get with steam blocking, and that'll give you a rough idea of what your wet blocking will be. Okay, so here's a question from last week's video. It says, what I'm wondering is what do you do when your swatch doesn't match the pattern gauge? When would you change the needle size without swatching again? And at what point would you decide to swatch again? Okay, this is a great one. So if I'm knitting a hat or a shawl or a cowl and I'm swatching and my gauge, my stitch gauge specifically, because we know that stitch gauge is definitely, the primary target. Row gauge is going to vary because we all have variances in our tension. So if your stitch gauge is off by half a stitch or one stitch, I might not re-swatch. I would simply go up or down a needle size as needs for that project and go, okay, that's probably going to get me really close. When it comes to being more than one stitch off, I would say re-swatch. That's, again, my personal preference. Everyone has their own tolerances, but especially if it's a garment like a sweater that actually needs to fit, or socks, again, that really need to fit. If you're more than one stitch off, I would definitely recommend re-swatching. I hope that answers your question. It's mostly, I guess I sort of correlate it to the financial and time investment that's going into your finished project, right? You might be able to knit a great little hat like this, or in this case, crochet, with one skein of yarn. So your investment in re-swatching it's pretty minimal. If you're going to be knitting yourself an entire sweater, you're investing hours, days, weeks, depending on how long it takes you, and potentially several $100s on yardage. So you want to make sure that that finished project is going to fit properly. All right, here's our third and final question of the day. If the swatch is washed and blocked before it's measured, does this mean I need to wash and block my sweater before measuring length for making the armholes or decreasing or other pattern options that require you to knit a certain number of inches? This is a really good question, and it's something that doesn't get talked about very often. If you are knitting a sweater that has you, say, knit to a length of 10 inches, let's just say the body is 10 inches long. If you are knitting your sweater and you obviously haven't blocked it yet, how do you measure 10 inches? Because it's going to grow with blocking. So this is why I feel bad that I omitted a step from last week's video. So let's correct it. When you're knitting a swatch, especially for a garment, it's not a bad idea to measure the swatch before you block it. So for example, let's say your blocked gauge is going to be 20 rows over 4 inches. So we know when we're all done and the swatch is blocked, we're aiming for that 20 rows over 4 inches. Before you block your swatch, if you measure those same 20 rows, it may be shorter. It may be 3.5 inches instead of 4 inches. So that will tell you that with blocking, you'll get about 1/2 inch over 4 inches of growth. So if you're then knitting 10 inches, you can expect 1.25 inches of growth between pre-blocking and post-blocking. So what that means is when a sweater pattern says knit to 10 inches, when you take out your measuring tape and physically measure that length, you're actually looking for a finished length of 8 3/4 inches, because you know that you're going to get that 1/2 inch of growth over every 4 inches that you knit. So yes, I should have talked about that in last week's video, and I'm really glad this question was asked, because that does help clarify that. You can measure pre-blocking and measure post-blocking to figure out how much growth you're going to get with blocking. I want to make sure you have all of the information you need to be successful. So here is the other thing I would strongly recommend you do. When you're knitting nice big swatches, because that's what we do now, right? Nice big swatches when we block for our sweaters. If you know that your row gauge is 20 rows equals 4 inches, you don't even need to measure your sweater. You can simply knit the number of rows that you require to reach 10 inches at your 20 rows over 4 inch gauge. So that means if you need to knit 10 inches and you know that 20 rows gives you 4 inches, you're going to knit 20, 40 would give you 8 inches, and another 10 would give you 2 more inches. So you'd essentially be knitting 50 rounds to reach 10 inches. Now, I know not everybody feels that confident with that method, but I will admit that that's how I knit my things. I know my row gauge, so I simply knit the number of rows I need to reach that. And that's why swatching is so very important. So swatching will give you the two options. You can either knit the total number of rows that you need, or you can measure pre-swatch and post-swatch blocking, or pre-blocking and post-blocking on your swatch, so you know how much growth you're going to get. So you definitely don't want to go to the effort of knitting, say, to 10 inches and then blocking it and measuring it. Because if you have to rip back for any reason, if you've knit too far, your yarn that you have to continue knitting with is now going to be all kinked up, because you've essentially blocked it and set the stitches. So your yarn is going to be super kinky and you're not going to enjoy reknitting with it. Which actually brings us to next week's video. But before I jump into that, let me just say, I know there are a lot of tricky pieces to swatching and getting it right. So please don't hesitate to ask more questions in the comments below the video, or you can send a question directly through the form on my website, which is also linked below. So next week, we are going to be talking about refreshing yarn, which is what we just talked about briefly there at the end of the last question. So next week, we're going to take another in-depth look at how to pull yarn out of a project. Let's even just say a swatch, because maybe you need your swatch yarn to finish your project. We're going to look at how to pull it out, what it looks like when you pull it out, how to refresh it so you can use it again so you're not knitting with that kicked up fiber that's all squiffly. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you got any value out of today's video or previous videos, remember to hit that like button. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. The more folks that are here, the more people we get to help on their knitting journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you next week, and happy knitting.